He says, was Marcion's or Luke, Marcion's Gospel, simply our Gospel of Mark? Is Mark a Marcionite creation? Do the origins of Christianity begin with Marcionism? How did Jewish Christianity emerge? Any info about Christianity and the Bible's origin would be great, thanks. Well, there's a real messy issue as to whether Marcion himself wrote or adopted a gospel text, or whether he had, something like Q, or whether he simply had a message, and that others, Marcionites and not, eventually wrote gospel narratives based on the Septuagint, which is my theory. That is, Marcionites rejecting the Jewish Torah, nonetheless found use for quite a bit of it in something Marcion himself would probably not have done, by rewriting a lot of the stories of Joshua, Moses, Elisha, Elijah, David, etc. into Jesus stories. And that once they started doing this, that Catholic and other style Christians did the same thing, whether or not they wanted to reject the Torah. Of course, Catholic Christians did not. And one can then ask two questions. Was the gospel that doesn't survive in any extant text, Marcion's gospel, the one that Marcionites used, that seems to have been related to our Gospel of Luke, though a shorter form? Marcionites said their version was the original. Catholics said no, Marcion has censored and edited the original, which is our canonical Luke. Either way, there's an admission that there is some sort of relation between the Gospel of the Marcionites and canonical Luke. So you have to ask, was that Gospel one of the, as Paul Louis Couchot asked, was Marcion's Gospel one of the synoptics? And he has a somewhat complicated theory, but holds that it couldn't be simply Mark, because some of the quotations from the Marcionite Gospel in the Church Fathers indicate some material that in the Gospels we are reading appears only in Matthew or Luke. So there was something else going on there, and he has, as I say, a complex theory about what Marcion's, or the Marcionite Gospel was. But then there are other views, of course. Richard Arthur, for instance, at the Unification Seminary and the Jesus Seminar, he holds to the, I think, the Griesbach hypothesis, and says that Mark was harmonizing and abridging Matthew and Luke. And that would fit with the Catholic patristic view of Marcion's Gospel as a cut version of Luke. There would, of course, be more to it, but that would be true as far as it goes, that description. And Arthur points out that the name of the gospel writer of our Gospel of Mark, well, it is the same as Marcion. And it may be, Marcion just means Mark the Less, like James Bar Alphaeus, James the Less among the 12 disciples, or Ajax the Lesser, and so on. The younger, the shorter, the less important, we don't know, could mean any of those things. It might be that the Gospel of Mark was simply the Gospel of Marcion, little Mark, Mark the Less, because Catholics did understand the name of the evangelist to be Mark. Maybe that's what the Marcionites called him. Now, again, I say Marcion may not have compiled a narrative gospel, but they could easily have said, well, this embodies the teaching of the master, Mark, and put it about as the Gospel of Mark, meaning Marcion. And when Catholic bishops decided to co-opt that document and to add to it. They said, okay, we accept the evangelist Mark, now that we've got a corrected text, but he couldn't be the same as that less important Mark who started the Marcionite heresy. So they may have just split him into two, much as Eusebius and others wanted to deny apostolic authorship to the revelation of John because they didn't like its doctrine. And so they said, well, it was another John. It wasn't John Bar Zebedee. It was the elder John. Yeah, that's the ticket. Some other guy named John. Same sort of thing could be going on. So it might well be. Now, then you have to let the other sandal fall and ask, well, what kind of a gospel is our Gospel of Mark? Well, I mean, we don't, of course, really know where it came from. We can make some inferences about its content, and what does it look like? Well, it does seem to have a vitriolic hatred toward the 12, and that is one of the distinguishing marks, no pun intended, oh my gosh, of Marcionism. Ted Whedon pointed this out in his great book, Mark, Traditions in Conflict. He said, the evangelist here in our Gospel of Mark sees the disciples of Jesus as just dull-witted idiots who consistently misinterpret Jesus and finally wind up opposing him. One betrays him, one denies him, and there's never any reconciliation. And again, who does that sound like? The idea that Christianity, as others, as Catholics practice it, is a bastardized Judaization of Christianity, and the wise will not accept the kind of Christianity that claims the 12 as its progenitors. Well, Mark's Gospel doesn't match what we know of Marcionism in every way, but there's some big examples of Marcionite coloring to Mark, and you can find almost, well, maybe even more in the Gospel of John, and touches even in our canonical version of Luke. And of course, you see, those are flies in the ointment too, because it means that Marcionite literary activity in our Gospels was a wider phenomenon, and we cannot simply on the basis of finding some Marcionite sounding material in a particular text say that it was any particular Marcionite text or that Marcionites compiled it at all. It may be that oral traditions or written snippets of stories that Marcionites had created were just gathered by Catholics or who knows who, creating our canonical Gospels, and they either didn't know or didn't care that there were Marcionite elements in them. So it's a very difficult question to ask, but a good question because it gives us an hypothesis for further study, and some are trying to study that and establish Mark as the Marcionite Gospel. Very interesting. Keep up the good work and let us know here on the Bible Geek what you found.